Okay, hello and welcome everyone. Thank you for joining me. This is our gathering number 20. So that's quite a bit, isn't it? Actually, we are quite far along in the Catechism of the Catholic Church. So this is how much we have already covered, and this is what remains. So we're moving along quite nicely. We are in the second section, if you will, of the Commandment to love, in the section, How do we live? Or in other words, how do we love? And so today we will speak about the 6th and the 9th commandment from the 10 commandments. And next week we will talk about the remaining of the commandments. So that will close off that section of the 10 commandments. But just let's take a few steps back and just kind of see where we are. We are in this this whole business of God giving his commandments is really a way for God to teach us how to live fully and how to live with love. And so these prohibitions that are given to us with respect to our love of God and love of neighbor are meant not only to be seen as prohibitions, but primarily, I think, as kind of a God shining a light on those areas of our life and our relationships that are most sacred and which deserve most protection and focus. So think of it in those terms. You know, when we talk about the commandments focusing on loving our neighbor, just think about those commandments and not only what is forbidden, but look at them as God shining a light on what is most sacred and most important for us to focus on. So the commandment, honor your father and your mother, right? It begins with shining a light on the importance of a relationship within a family, how sacred the family is, and it needs to be built up, and it needs to be restored and protected. When you look at the commandment, thou shalt not kill, again, God is shining a light specifically on life and the sacredness of life and the beauty of life itself, without which everything else is out the window. If we're not alive, we can't worship God, we can't praise God, and if we take someone else's life, we're not permitting that person to live out all these other beautiful virtues and gifts. Today we will talk about the 2 commandments that have to do with human sexuality. That's why I said at the beginning, today is fun. We're talking about sexuality. And it's always kind of interesting because I find that we fall into well, before I even say that, let me just say again, what is God shining a light on here? God is shining a light in saying, thou shalt not commit adultery, which is the commandment we're going to be looking at today, and also commandment number 9, thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's wife. What God is doing is shining a light on the sanctity and sacredness of human sexuality. Now that, to some people, may sound a little bit strange, because I find that whenever we bring up a topic of sexuality or whenever we hear people talk about sexuality, it's only too easy for us to revert to one of 2 extremes. One extreme is to talk about it in very crude ways, and so almost like minimizing the sacredness of sexuality and making it sound like it's nothing more than just another way to please oneself or to receive pleasure. It doesn't mean anything, in other words. And so when that happens, very often our talk about sexuality can be diminished to crude jokes and things. And honestly, if one's approach towards human sexuality is that it's just anything, it's just something for pleasure, then there's no reason why we shouldn't talk about it in those kind of lax ways. So that's one way in which I think we talk about sexuality, and this kind of minimizing its significance and kind of seeing it simply as just another thing. And the other extreme is to see sexuality as something that is sinful or bad. So those two extremes, it's either something that is purely for pleasure and therefore always good, or it's something that is always sinful and therefore should never be spoken about, and it's kind of a necessary evil we have to put up with. And both ways of speaking, those two ways I just described, are incorrect, because God would not give us a commandment on sexuality unless sexuality was worth shining a light on and therefore worth protecting. God would not be protecting something and singling it out unless it was worth protecting and therefore sacred. And so that's the first thing we have to understand, that in the Christian tradition, Judeo-Christian tradition really, human sexuality is seen as sacred, as good, and not only good, but better than good, as something that is very sacred. God chose to create us in a certain way, but God didn't have to create us as sexual beings. God didn't have to create us as male and female. God could have created us in many different ways, but God chose to create us from the very beginning as male and female, with this ability, this beautiful gift of expressing love and bringing about life, which are the two ends of the gift of sexuality, to love and to live. And sometimes the criticisms I've heard about the church's teaching on sexuality is that the church is obsessed with sexuality, all these prohibitions about sexuality, or that the church sees sexuality as something sinful. It's always sinful. It's always limiting us. But the truth is, the church, following on the revelation of God, what God has given us, sees sexuality as so sacred and so beautiful that it's worth safeguarding. And that's why we have these commandments. God does not give us commandments on things that are not important. So only on those things that are most important. What's so important about sexuality? I think the primary reason it's so important is because no other aspect of our creation or our relationship comes as close as sexuality to our ability to share with God in God's very nature. So what is God's very nature? God is love, right? And through our proper use of sexuality, we are actually able to express true love and to enter into that gift of love. And I'm not just speaking about romantic love, but just proper love for one another. But also, through the gift of sexuality, we are participating with God in his very act of creation, through procreation. Now, that is an incredible gift that God has given us, that in creating new life, God has created us in such a way that our act of love can actually bring about life, literally speaking. And so that's why we have, out of the 10 Commandments, 2 of them have to do with human sexuality. not because the church is fixated on limiting our pleasures, but precisely because the church sees sexuality as so sacred that it needs to be protected. And so that's the first point to make, is to say that the church's teachings around sexuality have everything to do with elevating the gift that is sexuality, and not squashing it or minimizing it or seeing it in a negative light. Does that make sense? I think it's important because sometimes we have to be even very careful with our children. In raising children, when they become aware of human sexuality, sometimes in the way we try to protect them from acting inappropriately, we can actually give them the wrong idea of human sexuality as something bad and sinful, and you shouldn't talk about it, you shouldn't think about it. But the idea is not to pretend it doesn't exist and just use it when absolutely necessary, but to properly understand its beauty in the proper context, and therefore not be ashamed of our sexuality. Men need women, and women need men. That's how God created us. And I think it's important. It goes all the way to the story of Genesis, where God created them, male and female, he created them. And so the church teaches in this act of creation that the fullness of our human experience is in the proper relationship between a man and a woman, male and female, women and men. Proper relationship. How do men and women, how are we viewed from God's perspective according to Revelation? The view is in the context of two words: equality, that's the first word, which is very important because it needs to continually be worked on, the equality between the two genders of male and female, the way God created them. They are made equal. One is not better or higher than the other in God's eyes, and therefore that should not be the case in our eyes. So equality, but also complementarity. Those are two very important words: equality and complementarity. What is equality? Equality doesn't necessarily mean that they are the same. Equality simply means that they are of equal dignity. We are of equal dignity, men and women. Complementarity means that we are different, that there are differences between us, and not only biological differences, but also in other ways, psychological differences in the way we relate. There are differences. If you don't believe me that there are differences, the next party we're allowed to go to, pay attention to what happens between men and women. I'll tell you what happens in my house. When we get together in a large family, the men usually go to the one corner of the room, and then the women go to the other corner. No one's telling anyone, you go with the women, you go with the men. It just seems to kind of naturally happen. And even when you listen to the way men interact with each other and women interact with each other, there are subtle differences. And those differences are very important. And that's why I say men need women and women need men. We need to learn how to have healthy and proper relationships with each other. And I remember when I was working before this job, I was the vocations director, and so for 4 years I had very little to do with women. I just worked with men who were studying to be priests, and at a certain point I just realized that I miss women in my life. There's something missing, I remember being in the parish, and the parish assistant was a woman, and the secretary, and there is there are ways in which we interact with each other that are helpful. When healthy, they're helpful and needed. And so I think in our world today, and always I think, but especially in these days, it seems to be there is this almost like there are some movements that try to divide men and women, almost to see us as if we're competitors, If men do well, then women are going to fail. But if women do too well, then men are going to lose out. But that's not the Church's view on the ideal which is presented in this commandment. The Church's view is that we are made by God, male and female. He created them in equality and equal in dignity, but different in many ways, and therefore complementing one another. And so that's very important in the life of the Church and in our life for healthy human relationships. This commandment speaks about, obviously, the beautiful gift of our human sexuality. And so our sexuality is not just supposed to be reserved for the sexual act, but our whole being our sexuality is present in our entire being. So who I am, how I react, how I interact, that's all an expression of my sexuality as well. And so we need to, as followers of Jesus, through this commandment, we need to be able to accept the gift of our sexuality and to work on it through the virtue of chastity. So chastity is a word that is used in how we are supposed, the other coin of the other side of that same coin. So the commandment says, do not misuse sexuality, so do not commit adultery. Well, adultery means having sexual interactions with another person who is married. Or if I'm married, not going outside of my marriage for that kind of an intimate encounter. But the other side, so what should we do with this sexuality? We should use it, see it for what it is, as a gift from God, and live within the virtue of chastity, which is the integration of our gift as sexual beings, or proper use of the gift, our sexual gift as human beings. And chastity is, the Catechism speaks about this chastity includes this apprenticeship in self-mastery, which is our real training in human freedom. So in other words, we are, our sexuality and our desires, sexual desires, are not supposed to control us, but we are supposed to control them and use them properly. Another way of looking at it, I suppose, is to see our sexuality not as something that belongs to us, just as we are supposed to see our life as not something that belongs to us and I can do with it what I want, but rather it is something that has been entrusted to me as a gift from God, which still belongs to God. So my life is not my own. It is God's gift to me, and I must take care of it and not simply mistreat it because it's my gift and now whoever gave it to me, it doesn't matter. So in the same way, our sexuality is part of God's gift, which still belongs to God, and so it needs to be used properly within our interactions with each other. And so chastity, when we speak about chastity, every person is called to live the virtue of chastity, which is the proper use of our sexual gifts. And even within marriage, sometimes people are surprised when we say within marriage, married couples are called to a life of chastity. Because even within marriage, the gift of sexuality can be misused or manipulated. Even when the law says, once I'm married to this person, I am allowed and permitted to have sexual interactions with this person, that doesn't mean that I do it at the cost of this person's dignity. It's still supposed to be used as a gift for the primary purposes of life and love. So unless my sexual interaction with my spouse is an expression of my love for this person, then I may actually be sinning against this commandment of respect of human sexuality. So in other words, if I'm demanding sexual intimacy from my spouse simply for my own pleasure and not out of the desire to love and express love and so on with the person, then even within marriage, I can misuse that gift. And we know what misusing God's gifts leads to. We see it all around our culture, that sexual promiscuity does not lead to healthy lives. It usually leads to depression and poor self-worth, people who are really confused about their own dignity and who they are and what they mean before others. And so this commandment is really, as difficult as it may be to use our sexuality properly, as difficult as it may be to preach it, the proof that this commandment actually works and is very important, and abuse of this commandment is harmful, the proof is all around us, and even could be within our own lives if we have experienced sins against the gift of human sexuality. We know how empty that can leave us. And so this commandment really is there not to limit our, as I said, our freedoms and our joys and pleasures in life, but simply to direct them in a way that's actually going to give us life and strengthen our love for one another. So as I said, chastity is the call for every human being. Now, there are different forms of chastity, obviously. A priest, my way of living chastity is different than a married man or a married woman's way of living chastity. But it still requires the same principle, which is respecting human sexuality, never using another person as an object for my own pleasure, for my own gratification. And it's not easy because we are, because of our fallen nature, often we are selfish in that way. We want pleasure, we want gratification, and we are hardwired to receive that from human sexuality. And so that's why this chastity is, the Catechism speaks about it as forming apprenticeship in self-mastery, that we actually have to fight against ourselves very often because our desires are deformed at different times because of that original sin, because of our concupiscence. In our world today, we have people who see human sexuality as the ultimate expression of freedom and happiness. But that is certainly, there's an element of truth in it, because as I said, human sexuality, that gift of human sexuality, when properly used, it is one of the most powerful ways for us to participate with God's creative work and God's loving work. That's how God created us. But it's also important for us to understand that our sexuality as a gift given by God has been wounded by sin. It has been wounded. And so it doesn't work properly. That's why married men will sometimes have these temptations that go beyond their marriage. Sometimes that's why a celibate priest may have temptations that are sinful. We are all prone to those sexual temptations. And so it shows that our sexual appetite is somewhat not working, not properly calibrated because of original sin. And that's why we have to struggle against it with the virtue of chastity. Peter Kreeft, who is one of the modern philosophers from Boston College, he's written many books on apologetics and philosophy and C.S. Lewis and so on. He had a very interesting talk once, and he said, imagine what would happen if you went to a town where a group of people gathered around in a bar, right? And then someone came out on stage with a plate covered with a cloth covering a plate. And then that person started slowly revealing what's on the plate, this beautiful pork chop. And everyone was going crazy, looking and getting excited over this pork chop. If you saw that, you would think, well, something must have gone wrong with the appetite for food in that little town. If people are taking this crazy pleasure in watching the uncovering of a pork chop, But the same could be said about human sexuality, right? With things that are available to us and often that we may be attracted to. That goes beyond the beautiful human sexual interaction between a man and a woman within marriage, with an openness to love and an openness to life. And so things like, we don't have to name them, but striptease and pornography and things like that, that's precisely it. If that expression of sexuality, if that is something we're attracted to, that means something's gone wrong with our appetite for sexuality. And we are all broken in this way. And so what is the answer? The answer is, again, chastity, which means constantly striving to properly use the gift of sexuality and only use it in the context to which God has given it to us, which is within marriage, openness to love and life. And that's it. Anything outside of that is sinful because it's an abuse of this very powerful and sacred gift. And so the church names, sometimes we say, well, what about same-sex couples and different things? Everything falls within the same category. Just because I have an attraction doesn't mean that that's something that I need to follow through with. We are all broken, and our appetite for sexuality is somewhat skewed. We can't trust ourselves fully. And so we have to trust that God's teaching on this is what will bring us to that fulfillment and happiness. So that's about sexuality. Yes, let's talk a little bit here about marriage and the sacredness of marriage, because in the Catholic Church, and I think we already talked a little bit about this as a sacrament, that marriage is between one man and one woman. It is for life. It has to be open to life, and it can't, we can't commit adultery, which means going outside of marriage and so on. But there is such a thing as, so in the Catholic Church we believe that divorce is not an option. Once two people are married validly in the Catholic Church, we believe that is for life. That doesn't mean that separation is not possible. Sometimes it may even be recommended in situations where two people just simply cannot be together. They've tried everything and it's just hard for both of them and destructive. They may separate and live separately. They would still be considered married. But there is such a thing as an annulment in the Catholic tradition, which is the right of every Catholic who has been married to question the validity of their marriage. So basically to ask the Church, could you investigate to see whether my marriage was valid from the very beginning? And the reason for that is because there may be some impediments that were present. And very often a good rule of thumb is if people get married, and there are problems from the very beginning, there's a good chance that there was some kind of an impediment present already at the beginning, which may have invalidated that marriage. And so it is possible in our tradition to receive the declaration of nullity once the Church investigates. So the Church would basically say, yes, you did get married, but because there was this circumstance present from the very beginning, that marriage was not indissoluble. And examples for reasons for receiving a declaration of nullity, as we call it, could be something like one of the parties not disclosing everything to the other one, something of a serious matter, a sickness or a psychological disorder. It could be that the maturity of the person, their understanding of what they are promising was not developed. From the very beginning, it could be proven that the person was just not mature enough to actually understand and to make a free consent, which is what is required to be married in the Catholic Church. So that's important to remember, that there is that aspect to marriage. And then it's also important when we look at the 9th commandment, which says, thou shalt not covet your neighbor's wife, that this commandment goes even deeper than just the action. So committing adultery is actually doing the act, but coveting your neighbor's wife is what Jesus talked about when he said, if you even fantasize about another person, you have already committed adultery in your heart. And so to me, this is beautiful, because our faith is not just about avoiding bad things, actions, but it has to do with how we form our hearts, how we look upon each other. And so it's not that we don't want to be kind of one way on the inside and acting on the outside in another way. There needs to be a unity of heart, mind, and activity. And so the 9th commandment really talks about the necessity for us not only to avoid committing adultery as an action, but actually not desiring things that are sinful. Don't just avoid the sinful things, but pray for the grace not to even desire those things in your heart by properly viewing one another and loving one another as God invites us to love one another. So that's the presentation on human sexuality, very brief one, obviously, but hopefully it gives you kind of a sense that this commandment is not just about avoiding some activity, but it's really about seeing the beauty of who we are, how we are made, and when properly using the gift of life and love and sexuality, then we are actually participating with the very act of God's love and life that he offers to us. That's it. We'll wait for questions online, and I'll invite you, if you have any questions or comments, you can say them now. Yes.
In high school and elementary school, how is the catechism taught here to young kids and to older kids? Does it bring in things like this, sexuality and?
Oh yes. Well, I can't really speak. I mean, you're you're a teacher, so maybe you can speak about it.
Not much.
Not very much.
They might cover in some religion classes, but I haven't taught the religion courses yet, so I'm not really well versed on how they incorporate it. Yeah, I'm not sure.
I'm more familiar with elementary school curriculum because I have the books, the religion books, and within religion there isn't much on human sexuality other than God creating human beings, male and female, those stories of creation and marriage and so on. But obviously for elementary school children it would be very, very basic. In high school I'm not sure how much they get into all those details.
I think it would be so helpful for young kids, not young adults, and the more openness and willing to talk about it. When I grew up, I'm 65 shortly.
Yeah.
When I grew up, everything was taboo, and the Ten Commandments were, this is the Ten Commandments, and you shall follow them or you're going to hell.
Yeah.
So I love the idea of, when my kids were growing up, I was very involved in all of the things they were in.
Mm-hmm.
And there are so many kids who lack getting good knowledge from their parents.
Mm-hmm.
And the kids suffer for it.
Yeah.
I just thought it would be nice if our Catholic schools.
Well, I'm sure, I know, sometimes I get students who come and they want to talk about certain things, or I know teachers are there for them. The challenge, well, here's another teacher. The challenge I think that we will always face is that a teacher cannot replace the parent. And the minute we try to do that, we get into all sorts of trouble. And sometimes, yes, teachers have to go a little bit beyond their responsibility as teachers, but you can't go. You can't do what if parents won't do it. The school will do some of it, but it's not going to supplement fully the responsibility of parents. That's why we always talk about and encourage people about the triad. In the Catholic education is all based on family, school, and parish. So the school cannot give them what they will get at church. And the school cannot give them what they will not get at home. The school can only give them what the school is capable of giving them within their curriculum. And so
And I do think we expect as a society too much from teachers. We expect them to be so open.
it's hard, I'm sure,
We
right?
expect a lot from them, but I feel bad for the kids who don't get it.
Yeah. And I mean,
But I might add, though, that what you said tonight would be a great way to teach it.
okay, thank you. I think in general, to teach commandments by looking at kind of a broader picture and say, like, what is it that, I like this image of God shining a light on different sacred elements of our human experience and why they're sacred. And, because especially with young people, with teenagers, telling them what not to do sometimes can backfire,
In the context of love.
But if we understand why it's sacred and why it's important, and also I think it's very important to not shy away from the beauty and the clarity of God's teaching on these issues. So, someone can say, well, I know they're not going to follow it, so I'll just kind of, I won't talk about it too much. It's not for you to assume whether they will follow it or not. They may surprise you. These young people may surprise you. And I've seen it. Most of my ministry was with university students. But I've seen how much they desire. young people today, they experience a culture that is sexualized in the wrong way, I think. And so very early on at university, I would meet with young people who were fed up with it. They said, this is not life-giving. And so in some ways, they may be more ready for this, the beauty of the Christian message on sexuality than we think, than maybe we were at their age, you know. I don't know if you have any comments on that.
I haven't taught religion either, or any sexual education classes, so I don't see it too much in high school, but yeah, I agree, it should be approached more in elementary school for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I would concentrate so much on the need to teach the biological teachings of sex, you know, and sexuality. And we've opened that book up, as it were, you know, compared to the dark ages in which I grew up. But we're doing it outside of what God means, you know, that to be. We're doing it as a very scientific, biological teaching, and teaching earlier and more in depth about what all of that is.
Yeah.
But we're not linking it up with the sacredness, the responsibility, the all of that. You know, it has to be both and.
You know, my desire would be, if we want to find a beautiful way of seeing God's writing in the biology of human sexuality, Pope John Paul II's teaching theology of the body is a beautiful way that would help with that. Because in it, you know, I don't know if you've read the book Theology of the Body by John Paul II, but it's really his most important work, I believe, in his entire body of work he did as a theologian and philosopher. But the whole idea is that God, he called it theology of the body because he said within our biology, theology is written. God's purpose is written right into our bodies and how we're created and how we function and what we desire, and the sexual act and all of that actually reveals God's creation and God's purpose for us. It's really quite profound.
The other thing I think that is very difficult, and if there could be, not, I don't want to say counseling, but teachings. There are many, many young adults in the world who are gifted with a partner, want a life partner, want to have families, but are not, for whatever reasons, you know, and of course some in that sorrow and loneliness will go in a very bad way, you know, and others live with a grief, as it were, you know, and of course the desires to express love in that way not available. And if there was ways that we could meet with these young people, with these young adults who are living these lives without that which God desired, you know, I think it would be so helpful for these young adults to learn to what? I don't know, but to live with that sorrow, you know, and that situation in their lives. And many of the things that happen sexually in the world are because of that void, you know, like you said in the outset, men need women, women need men.
I think we need to find a way to connect men and women of similar age and teach them how to be friends and create a way for good friendship, which friendship should always be first. if we don't know how to properly love and listen and wonder at each other as men and women, but we, just jump into bed thinking that that's the only way we can.
It's sad.
We actually cause more damage
Yes.
to that
Decided
relationship.
to focus there, sort of, the cart before horse,
Yeah.
as it were, there's such a focus on sex and
Yeah,
as being that which is necessary for good relationship, right?
right.
And,
Yeah.
and that's not true.
No, and we do these studies with married couples and with couples who are preparing for marriage, and I was involved in them. They're called Focus, and now there's another way. And usually we would have them fill out these questionnaires and then find most common, like, telltale signs that this relationship may fail. The two areas that seemed to be most prone to leading to divorce and breakups were finances and lack of communication.
Mm-hmm.
It wasn't sex. But communicate, and even finances have to do with lack of communication, but knowing how to be with each other.
Yes.
And that's why when you remove sexual intimacy, you're forcing people to learn how to be with each other and how to be intimate with each other in different ways. Like, I remember one friend of mine who left his fiancée at the altar. And I said, "Why did you do that? This was a good guy." And he said, "I was addicted to sex. It clouded my judgment because we rushed into it, and so then you're almost like you're not able to fully grow. There are areas of your relationship that are underdeveloped because you're putting something that is supposed to be an expression of all these areas having reached their fulfillment. Now an expression, you're taking that and making it a means of bringing about growth. And it's not meant for that.
No.
Yeah.
I've always thought too, what a sad commentary. You often hear a man and a woman can't be just friends.
Mm-hmm.
You hear that a lot.
Yeah.
If a man and a woman are good friends, then there's rumors and gossip
Right.
all
Yeah.
the time.
That's right.
And that's so sad.
That is.
It's really, really sad.
But it just shows you how fixated we are in a wrong way on sex.
That's right.
Right? As if, and it makes no real sense to me because like we see signs all over that that's not true. Like we see, if sex was a solution to all the problems, why would we have all these problems? People are having more sex today than ever, probably. And yet we have more problems, relationship problems. People calling in, writing to newspapers about being lonely within a sexual relationship. Like, so if we just listen to God, like, His commandments are really there to help us, not to make our life difficult. Yeah. Mark, did you have a question?
So sexuality and everything it's this sacred thing, and it's the great love and commitment and everything, expression between two people. That's why it's so sacred. Is masturbation a sin then?
Yes. Any misuse of human sexuality. So I didn't want to get into it because those are kind of downers, if you list. But yes, the Catechism mentions pornography, masturbation, any kind of acting out outside of the context of a married man and a woman open to love and life. Anything outside of that would be using the sacred gift of sexuality merely for human pleasure. Yeah.
Yeah, I think a lot
yeah, I don't know if people don't know or if it's I don't know what the reality is out there. Certainly, the pornography industry on the internet is the highest grossing industry on the internet by far, which tells you how much enslavement in the area of sexuality is present in the world, you know. And often people get addicted to those sorts of things, you know. It can be very highly addictive, acting out sexually, you know. And just it's not fulfilling. It doesn't. It's because it's not meant for that, right? And yet, that's why I say we're all broken in our sexuality. I like saying it that way because all of us at times will have sexual desires that are forbidden to act on by God. And so how do we justify that? How do we explain that? Well, we explain it in the same way we have other desires that are forbidden. God created us in a certain way, but then original sin kind of left us somewhat broken. And so now the whole process, the whole progress of growing in holiness is God kind of being like a chiropractor and readjusting our soul and our desires in a way that they should be. So it's our growth in holiness is not just supposed to be staying away but still desiring the sinful things, but actually allowing God to slowly change our desires so that we can desire what He desires, that which is truly good, you know. And God will do that, but it is a long process of healing that we all have to undergo. That's why, you know, with this, a lot of the things that are being spoken about sexuality, whenever it's presented as if, well, you know, it's just a natural desire, that's such a bad way of talking about it. Because we can have all sorts of natural desires for bad things. And it doesn't mean I should act on it, you know. Our nature is wounded. So natural wounded desire, yes, that's a more proper way of saying it, but that doesn't mean it's necessarily good for me. Yeah. Okay, I think we've gone long enough. So I leave you with it. Pray for the gift of chastity for yourself, your children, for our world, and do everything you can to form good and healthy relationships with the opposite sex. I think it's very important, especially for us Christians, to show that we can live and love one another without feeling like we have to act it out in ways that are reserved for intimacy within marriage. Okay? Goodbye, everyone.